You gotta select where you want to cut it. Then cross it. No, no, you gotta select.
Just directly
Select it and this one now.
yes.
You don't have to. It automatically cuts it.
How are you? Good. Yeah. Yeah. What are you up to? Your wife? Oh, okay. Good. With him? Sorry.
What is that? Just doing this.
That's cool. How are you managing? Oh my goodness. Wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's good to see you. Have fun. Have a seat. Yes. Okay, here.
No, I was doing other things. Tomorrow, I went to my high school reunion in Atlantic City and my niece in Westchester. Not Westchester, Westchester. Yeah. I'm still alive.
That was last time. Yeah, no, she got a new job. She's doing a super chef. Stefan?
I think they're meeting, you know, where Charlie's office.
Well, I lived in. Yeah. When you used to. It's a little, but it's so long. There's so much to see. You always stay on the. Oh.
Hey. 演讲中那个。
No, I don't. All right, you may have told me I forgot.
At least 10 years ago. You're Jewish.
Yeah.
You're Jewish, yes. So we did a little
And we
thing.
didn't know each other. Oh my.
That's how we met.
Oh my.
And I said,
Lord works in mysterious ways.
we had lunch, we built a contact. And I said, when monthly art shows, would you like to go to the opera?
How are you? Good.
And we went, came back, we did one show, and the second show, a young woman from Casablanca.
Oh, Vanessa. Yeah,
You know,
I know. Maybe in the house.
so it was great, great show.
Yeah.
When she came, she was Texas.
Oh, okay, yeah. She's a nice girl. oldest son, Jonathan, was married back in the year from March.
He told me.
But he was pregnant.
Congratulations.
Okay.
My son was-
Oh, okay. Is that your first one?
Forget to sign in. I was told to say that. Did you sign in?
Oh, yeah.
What?
You know, having.
Huh? Oh.
Long time no see. How are you? We met last week. How are you? Nice to see you. I'll go too though. Great to be here. Where it all started. Back in 1988. I found him. It's a good story. So,
I'm not sure.
Candy, I've already had a ton of candy. And, we're so, I think it's probably gonna be pretty plug in.
Yeah, I'm not worried about it.
Oh, I guess it's mom in position, yeah. She may sit in her thing. I mean, okay. None of this sitting in the back of the room. I'm looking at you. Move up front. Everybody move. No hiding. Ready?
Oh, yeah. You wanna?
No.
You signed in? You know the drill. I got to. Dan, you signed in?
Not yet.
Get it!
Yes, ma'am.
Before they take it down, you're not even here right now. Now you sign in?
留地方，我那个还没扫完呢。啊。别让我多放一个。
You signed in? Like your
I will. Yeah.
Good. How are you? Good. Yeah. Yeah. I'm good. What about you? Your footage looks amazing. Yeah.
Okay, Fred, how far do you want my head forward? Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. I'll clear my throat. Okay. Oh, it's a Sony something. No.
Like 20 minutes because then you have to take gym to the
Yeah, it's funny because all I heard was that people didn't take them out because they looked so big. It looks fine to me, but at least that's what I heard. That people would prefer to use a Sony DSLR. Yeah. Yeah. Here it looks like you're very serious about and professional about what you're doing. That's so.
In there.
So it's got that going for it.
Sweet. Thank you.
Oh, pass it. Did not pass it. Yeah, I was born and raised there. Here, this is a little bio. At the approximate point that person is
All the way in the back.
Yes. I like that there's the space for the notes.
sorry I missed you. I came to ask. Please call me. New York?
Yeah, we just got. Anyway, I just turned over.
I know. You can drink coffee at this hour. Okay. Yeah. Wow. I would be up until December.
Yeah. It's like this.
We're here. We're ready.
Is this one on? Hi, everybody.
Hi, Charlie.
Last week I was accused, justly so, of not speaking into the microphone. And so a lot of people said they couldn't hear me. So for the next half hour, I'm just going to talk about me. I got to make up for last week, don't I? Welcome, everybody. Welcome, students, faculty, and a lot of guests here, some old friends, and particularly our distinguished panel. This is one of a number of events marking the history of this program, 30 years now. It's really only 29, but something like that. No, it's really 30. I just don't want to seem so old, but anyway. This program has undergone a lot of change through all those years, and most of it for the good, and including this space, which is we use for all these kinds of events all the time and any time. And so I want to thank all of the previous alumni and students who helped pay for it. And I also have to acknowledge that this is the Schleimflug lecture series. The Schleimflug Society is named after a famous optical scientist, but it was coined by Mr. Peter Schwarzwein as a club of student activities here some years ago. So he just said I stole the name for the lecture series. So I guess I'll give it back to you, and you can run all the lecture series henceforth. These series of lectures are all kinds of people, our own alums, outside people, artists, activists, creative people of all sorts. And this program embraces anything to do with the lens and screen arts. And we have a wonderful group of alumni here who come from our first class 30 years ago. He still looks like he's 29. Brian Palmer, who has distinguished himself as a photojournalist, filmmaker, artist. He said, I said activist. He said he doesn't use that word, and we're going to do away with that word. We're just all curious, active in our communities, investigating, as Quinn Trivy said earlier, and trying to use our creative forms in productive, meaningful ways that help inform people, enlighten people, and make them a little more human. Somebody recently, and I'm sorry, I don't know exactly the source of this, but a famous artist said, the reason to go to art schools is not to learn necessarily to be a professional artist, but rather to learn how to think, to act, to engage in ideas and in the forms of your culture. And I think that's why most of you really are here. And many of you will become very successful artists if you're here for that reason. Brian, as I said, is going to be our interlocutor here, our sort of host with the other panelists. He's also going to talk about his own recent work. He's been on the front lines of a number of battlefields. He's been on the front lines. He began his career at the Village Voice, by the way. Is that right? Which just folded, as you all know, a few months ago. And I'm happy, and he's the oldest living member of our alumni. Quinn Trivy, sitting next to him, is a fairly recent. You graduated, what, 2015-ish? Yeah, there was a little thing. A very active artist, and as he said, investigator, whose involvement with his grandmother's AIDS Foundation and as a representative, as a family member, as a officer and ambassador is rather a remarkable issue. He's just back from a little vacation and he's jet lagged, but we pepped him up with a little sauce. Peter Schwarzwein comes to us. By the way, everybody has traveled here. Richmond, Virginia. You just came from Virginia. From Switzerland. Peter comes from El Paso, Texas, where he sits on the city council and evolved his thesis project into a major community project, which has become real after all these years, the Trolley Project. And he is an active politician and engaged in the concerns of his community, but also the concerns of our nation. Susanna Saylor, you graduated in 99, I think, is that right? Is a full professor and tenured professor at Syracuse University. After her thesis, her interest in environmental concerns, she, with a partner, started what is known as the Canary Project, which is involved with environmental concerns, involves other artists who are addressing these issues. And she is very active, I won't use activist, in organizing others and her own work to address this very pressing need of our society, to wake up and say there is something called a changing environment that is in danger. I'm not going to go on any further, except once again to thank all these people for traveling and being here. They're kind of a cross-section of who this department is and has been, and hopefully will continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, folks. I would say that this is a homecoming for me as someone who came into the class of, well, came in 88 and left in 1990, but I never really left. I've stayed connected to SVA and to Charlie and to the president of our institution, David Rhodes, who just came in. And I'll try and explain why. I want to start, I have missing fonts, I see. I want to start all the way up here. And so I'm beginning with an image that is of me, but that I did not make. You'll see down here, it's Dhaka, Bangladesh. The photo is 2010. The photo is by my wife, Erin Holloway Palmer. For those of you who may remember me from those days in 88, 89, 90, that was an expression you seldom saw on my face. I was caught up in trying to be photographer, image maker, journalist, documentarian, witness, artist, activist, citizen. I thought for sure that to be real, I had to be one or two of those things, not all of those things. And in fact, now I am all of those things in varying degrees. And I can't tell you what degrees, but I start here in 2010, so I don't have to give you a linear presentation of 30 years. But I can talk about the themes that this image touches on for me, and the themes, words that kind of defined my career and the trajectory of my career since leaving here in 1990. Collaboration is something that I didn't do very much back in the day, but it is something that I started to learn how to do here at SVA as I became more comfortable with myself as an image maker. This is me and my wife, Erin Holloway Palmer, at East End Cemetery. So as Charlie said, I've traveled very, very many places. It's sort of ironic, weird, paradoxical, all of those things that I've wound up in a tiny cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, 2 cemeteries actually, not so tiny, 76 acres, helping document and restore these places. And I'll try and give you a sense of how I got there, but it's just, again, for you students, it is also paradoxical that several years after leaving New York, I'm probably more prolific, more engaged, and happier than I've ever been. So this is an op-ed I did for the Times, New York Times last year about these places. But as Charlie said, I started my career here at the Village Voice in 1988, just as a graduate student and as a street shooter. I was drawn to conflict. You all may remember that look up top there, in 1991, there was some unrest in the streets of New York City. But I show you these pictures. I'm stepping back 2 years, 1989, Beijing. It's my second year here in the program. And I'd studied in China as an undergraduate at Nanjing University, 84, 85. The unrest in China happened June 4, 1989, and I wanted to go. I'd asked my professors here, and there were a whole lot of, nope, sorry, can't do that, can't do that. I asked Charlie, and Charlie said, go. And I say that with a straight face because that was a very important conversation that we had. SVA for me it started with Charlie. This was an experiment. Charlie put this together. I know he had help. I know there was a team, but it was a startup, as we call it now. It was a work in progress. We argued. We had differences of opinion. I was young. I thought I knew everything, and I'd tell him how to do things. And of course, that didn't work out all the time. But what did work out is that Charlie would listen. He wouldn't try and beat me up and say, this is the right thing to do. You must do this thing. He would listen. And if he thought I was doing the wrong thing, he would tell me. And that started a conversation that's been going on for 30 years. He allowed me to do this work, which I think I feel very, very strong about this particular work, because I was able to go to China, spend several months there. And during this very tense time, I wasn't being a big old journalist, fancy journalist. I was riding trains and I was trying to get people to talk to me. And for those folks who may know something about China at that time, it was not a great time to talk to people because people were very afraid of the backlash from the government. But here in New York, I came back. This is where the activist thing sort of comes in. I mean, I photographed on the streets of New York because that's where I wanted to be. Here at SVA, I think we'd all been hit by that breaking wave of postmodernism and post-structuralism. I mean, it had broken well before this, but we were all wrestling with this idea that the author is dead, there's no originality. And for me, I wanted to be profound. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a Starn twin. I wanted to do that kind of profound work, and yet my gut made me want to document what I saw out in front of me. And that comes, it may be a generational thing. It may be being the son of a woman who experienced systemic racism here in New York, the son of a man who grew up under Jim Crow and in some ways I think was battered and beaten by it. It may be because I'm a child of the Vietnam War, but I had to kind of navigate this zone between the literal, be there in front of David Duke's face, show him that a black man has the courage to keep shooting when these interesting people are trying to disencourage, I know that's not a word, discourage some of us from doing what we do. I had to be present, I had to be a witness, and I had to record what I saw. Clinic Defense here in New York, Operation Rescue Randall Terry, one of the Shank brothers. I always get them mixed up. It's Daryl or whomever, but they're holding a stolen fetus there. From my work in New York, I took a job at US News and World Report in order to get paid. By the time I left the Village Voice in 1993, my salary was about $9,000. And that was, with freelance work, was probably about $14,000. Not a lot of money. So I took to the mainstream, and it was an interesting time. But I also found that in order for me to be anything more than a mere literal recorder of things, someone who was trying to navigate that continuum between the literal, just the facts, ma'am, and the lyrical, the expressive, the interpretive, I had to get out in the street again and do more than simply just document what was out in front of me, but think, study, learn, and investigate. I'm stealing Quinn's word, but I will give it back to him. And to live. So my other tours through the mainstream took me to being a CNN correspondent. I show this because I wanted success on someone else's terms. So I did 9/11 and Brian Palmer, CNN, Kabul. And I did that for 2 years. And when I decided to leave, my dad told me, "You're crazy, son." But I realized that I couldn't simply be defined by my business card. And certainly, and surely enough, once I left CNN and didn't have the business card, nobody returned my calls. But that worked out just fine because I did a series of work that I'm sort of drawn to conflict, spent some time in Iraq with a Marine unit. I wanted to see what US troops were doing in the name of Americans, and it was not pretty. And there was also a little subtext that I didn't mention to anyone, certainly not to my mother, which is that, well, real reporters cover war. So I thought. So I went to war, and it's really quite a simple equation. Actually, war kills people and it destroys things, and you don't need to go to war to understand that. And it breaks parts of people, as it did to me. Knowing people who were killed who didn't need to die like Sergeant Edgar Lopez, and being at Arlington Cemetery randomly on a day in 2008, hearing gunfire for the 19-gun salute, and then just finding my way over to the section and recognizing the names of dead Marines there, Marines who I'd been in Iraq with. Now, of course, most of the suffering was done by Iraqis, but the point is, people just plain old died. My life took an interesting turn when my father passed away. My wife, Erin, and that's my dad, second from the left. My wife found this picture among he was an amateur photographer and a slob, so he had pictures all over the place. But this is a picture from 1998 from a place called the Armed Forces Experimental Training Activity. It's a euphemism for secret spy squirrel base. It's where the CIA trains, it's where the farm is. So I also recognized the name on the headstone. It was my great-grandfather, but I didn't really care all that much about it. I wanted the bragging rights of saying that I'd been to the secret spy squirrel base. So I went, I arranged a trip, and then once I got there, what do people say now? I did the math. I did the math, and I realized this person, my great-grandfather, was most likely someone's property, an enslaved person. And in fact, he was. He was owned by a gentleman named Mabon Hobson, whose house is still standing in Goochland, Virginia. So I visited. This direction from being defined by CNN, from doing all this worldly stuff, which I don't discount because it's made me who I am, sent me in a very different direction. One of the directions was to do a story on Black funeral homes. That this person is Judge William Stone. He gave me the run of his funeral home for a period of months. But he said one thing: you can photograph anything, but I don't want you photographing my workers cleaning people up, fixing them up before they go on into the casket, because my business is dignity. I want my customers, the deceased folks, to have dignity. So I followed his rule, and my assignment from a particular publication disappeared because they wanted the dead bodies. It turned out that I ended up covering Judge Stone's death. He was an Energizer bunny of an 80-plus-year-old man. No one thought he would die, and he did. He happens to be the person who buried my father's sisters and brothers, my grandparents on my dad's side. So again, I went from these big stories to something that seems so small and yet so intimate, because what I feel that I'm doing is reclaiming pieces of our collective history that are not regarded as collective American history. The Black stuff is Black stuff in the same way that the Latino stuff is in the women's stuff. No, this is central to us. We just have to understand that. There are narratives that we work against, particularly where I live in Richmond, Virginia, every day. This is a flag that flies in a public cemetery in an African-American neighborhood. This cult of the Confederacy, this cult of Robert E. Lee, this idea that the lost cause of the Confederacy represents anything more than a nostalgia for a time when people are property, is deeply disturbing to me. And yet I still try and cover it with a kind of a sensitivity. And I won't say that there's no judgment in my pictures, and I'm sure you may detect a little bit of that, but I hope there's also some empathy and sensitivity. But the argument that this is heritage and not hate, the hate is baked in to the ideology of the Lost Cause, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, rests on this idea that essentially Black people liked slavery. And that would be something hard to argue to my great-grandfather who escaped slavery, to my great-grandmother who escaped slavery, and to all the other people, 500,000 people who escaped slavery. So I've also spent a fair amount of time documenting monuments that have come down, monuments like that in Charlottesville that are still up. I'm working on a piece for the Smithsonian about public funding for these things. But the ideology is clear. The speaker at the dedication for the Jefferson Davis Monument said precisely these words: "The great crime of the century was the emancipation of the Negroes." So this was the dedicatory speech as they laid the foundation. And yet you had an African-American man, John Mitchell Jr., who, when this statue was dedicated in 1890, spoke it plain at the risk of being lynched. And he was often threatened with lynching. He said that you're essentially celebrating treason. So these are people spending $4,400 of our taxpayer money to clean off graffiti. There's always been resistance to these things, I guess is my point. When I talk about public funding and how certain narratives are supported and how other narratives are not, again, this is a public cemetery, but a special section for Confederates. So it's been underwritten with public money for over 100 or so years. This is the African-American cemetery, one of the cemeteries where I volunteer. This is a cemetery. There are headstones in here. This is Evergreen Cemetery last year. It was cleaned up, this part of it, and it looks like this again, because that's what happens in the summer. So a brief, I'm hoping that this link works. In addition to trying to physically reclaim, it was not password protected this morning. My wife and I and a group of people are working together to both physically reclaim these cemeteries, but also to reclaim them narratively and historically. Again, these people, this history is part of our collective history. So we know all about Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and all of these people on Monument Avenue, but we know so little about the African-American men and women who essentially built the city of Richmond, people like Rosa Dixon Bowser. So what we're doing in our cemetery of roughly 17,000 interments packed into 16 acres, we're trying to document whoever we can document and photograph whatever we can photograph. So I've been, over the past few years, just trying to do straight but interesting treatments of all the headstones. Then we do our archival research on various people. So I'm coming to a close. Sorry about that beep. So as I was talking about, this is not, it's not a story of tragedy that these, oh, woe is me, that these African-American sites have been neglected and so on and so forth. That's true, but there's another lens that we can use. It's the lens of opportunity, of potential, of recognition that people want to tell the story and save these places. Now, full 180, activist. So I don't like that label. I'm a citizen. And I feel that as an image-making citizen, as a writing citizen, as a video-making citizen, I have to try and affect positive change. So this gentleman, Dr. Shahidul Alam, is photographer, human rights activist who was imprisoned, jailed by his own government, August 5th of this year. I met him in 2002, and he played a very similar role that Charlie has played for me. I went to cover his photo festival in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and I saw someone who was trying to do something completely different. This is someone who started a photo school, who started a media academy for Bangladeshi photographers and journalists, but he's also an ambassador for South-South discussions. Anybody heard that term before? South-South, what do you think it means? It means that not everything has to be filtered through Europe and the US. It means that a Tanzanian photographer can talk to a Bangladeshi photographer. A photographer from Hangzhou can have a great conversation with someone from Mumbai, and they can talk about their histories and cultures. It's not that Europe and the US are irrelevant, it's that we don't need to plow those old pathways in order to generate new and wonderful knowledge. So look up Shahidul, check out the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's an amazing person, and he changes lives one person at a time. That is all I got to say.
That was great. So I'm Quinn. I graduated the semester before this fancy new building came in, so it's particularly exciting to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So let's see. There's a play button or something, right?
Yeah, there is.
Where does that go?
Yeah.
This?
Yeah.
Play from start. Thank you. So I think by way of brief background, before SVA, I was working in film. That's what I did in my undergrad. Super quick slide for the type of photography that I probably included in my application here, which was commercial and editorial and etc. Shortly after getting accepted and during the beginning of my time here, I pivoted and created a book based on found material. Inside this envelope that I photographed is one of a number of reels of homemade porn. Orgy scene starts, 2M, 2F, toe tickling cock, ends abruptly, maybe still like fashion photography. But this was published via Llewellyn Projects, a fellow SVA alum. And then I experimented a bit throughout the program, and my thesis work was this was the installation, which was a series of 3D backlit lenticular light boxes that were algorithmic abstractions of other people's photographs in an effort to investigate what I think probably every group of photographers critically thinking about the idea of photography since the advent of photography have been considering, which is the abundance of photography. And so then shortly after finishing my thesis, I began transitioning more and more into the related media category and came up with some more sculptural work and photo-based / sculptural work. This was at BAM the year after I finished. And then these were just examples of continued evolution of practice and investigation, again, a little more sculptural, but I think still rooted in photographic principles that we could talk about a bit more later. These as well, and then these most recently, just a couple months ago. The bottom one, I actually just donated to 2x2 for AIDS and Art in Dallas, which supports the Dallas Museum of Art and AMFAR. So all of that quick background about my art practice via SVA, which is, I think, stylistically quite different than the way I have used a camera and the type of work I have done with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. So Elizabeth Taylor was my grandmother, and if anybody is not familiar with her, she was a famous celebrity and actress turned activist and philanthropist. And about maybe a month or two or a few weeks, it was right after I graduated, I actually became a trustee of her estate, brand, because celebrity licensing deals, and foundation, which is supported in part by revenue from those other components. And so my experience, however, with her foundation began just before starting at SVA. But before I get into some of that work and a little bit more of that background, I think it's important to paint a quick picture as to why it's important to be talking about HIV and AIDS today. So here are a few facts that I've put together. 40,000 people are diagnosed with HIV each year. 39% of all new HIV cases are among young people aged 13 to 29. At least, which is, I think, a considerable portion of the folks in this room. At least one teenager or young adult in this country is infected with HIV every hour of every day. The CDC predicts that 1 in 2 Black men who have sex with men will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. Take a moment to consider that staggering fact. African Americans make up 44% of all new HIV diagnoses, although they comprise only 12% of the total US population. 8 in 10 new youth HIV cases occur in young people of color. Men who have sex with men make up 2% of the population, but 67% of all new HIV infections. Only 1 in 3 men who have sex with men have ever been tested for HIV. 1 in 23 women and 1 in 36 men who inject drugs will be diagnosed with HIV in their lifetime. And this is under the global umbrella of nearly 37 million people worldwide living with HIV, about 2 million infections annually, and the United States ranking within the top 10 of new infections globally. And I think that these stats here actually paint a remarkable picture towards the intersection between the broad idea of social justice and social concerns and a host of ugly isms like racism and sexism and financial inequality that intersect with the health story of HIV, as highlighted here in these heat maps that show an obvious overlay between HIV concerns in the US, people living with poverty, mandated abstinence-based sex ed, which plays into education and other factors as well. So now that I've hopefully painted a bit of that picture in a contemporary sense as to why it's important to be talking about this here in the US and anywhere around the world, I'll backtrack to a few months before getting into SVA, when I began investigating the work that my grandmother was doing in her life and that her foundation was continuing to do in her death. I wanted to learn more about the work that she had committed herself to in the latter part of her life, and what was being carried on through her foundation. And so I began a journey around the US using the camera as a tool to get to meet people and get to converse with them. I'm sure everybody has read theory on that. So this is Mary from Jerusalem House in Atlanta, who through a housing program here was able to rebuild her life after battling homelessness and a drug addiction that lasted about 7 years, during which she also contracted HIV. This is Paul, who I met in Dallas, Texas at the resource center there. In 1992, he became HIV positive. Shortly after leaving the small town he grew up in, New Mexico, where the only known gay person was referred to as, quote, that fucking faggot by his own mother. Paul used to take 30 pills a day. Now he takes about 2 or 3 to combat his HIV. This is Michael, who I met in Portland, Oregon at the Cascade AIDS Project. He was a volunteer tester there when I met him, and his story that he shared with me during our portrait session was that he asked his partner if his partner was HIV negative and had been tested. His partner lied and said that they were tested and were negative. And then some months later, Michael started to get sick and learned that he was HIV positive. I got tested myself there. And with that, I would encourage everybody in the audience to get tested regularly. It is simple and straightforward, and the first effective step anybody can take in protecting their health, the health of those that they share themselves with, and being part of this conversation in a critical way. After doing this cross-country trip and then getting back into SVA and then obviously making a whole different type of body of work, I finished the program and I think, as I mentioned, became a trustee of my grandmother's estate, and including an officer of her foundation, and of course an ambassador in a public sense as well. And so under that umbrella, I had the opportunity to visit some of the work that she was funding internationally. So in 2008, she began a series of funding a series of mobile healthcare clinics based in Malawi, which is, depending on the agricultural yield at any particular year, arguably the poorest country in the world, or one of the poorest countries in the world, where villagers in this rural area had to walk sometimes over 24 hours to reach healthcare, or up to 24 hours. And with the introduction of the mobile vans that she was funding, had to walk no more than an hour, if not a few minutes, depending on the location. So I had a chance to meet a lot of the people here affected by her funding in that region, and obviously document the process. So a mobile van would pull up and set up shop in a community center, for example, as seen here, where nurses would then tend to folks with a variety of health concerns, including, of course, HIV testing and sex ed practices, if needed. A concern of ours in 2012, and I say that before I was even involved, but of ours in 2012, was that the data was showing that, actually I'll skip ahead for a second, that we were only able to reach 1 man for every 5 women in this area for testing. So if you count the baby as a girl, then this photo that I took at one of the testing centers there is a perfect representation of that unfortunate ratio of 1 man to every 5 women. But after introducing a number of interventions, including targeting men specifically at their places of employment, seen here, it's a tea estate, which is one of the major employers in the country, we were able to lower that ratio from 1 to 5 to 1 to 1.2 and address a number of stigma and sexism related issues at the same time. We were also able to introduce a number of innovative programs, including door-to-door testing in the communities that has, in those pilot programs, yielded about like 98, 99% of the people approached who didn't already identify as HIV positive. The 98, 99% of those people agreed to be tested, which is an amazing success story. And this is a sense of the area and the community, obviously very rural, that the foundation has funded on the international front. So to wrap that back in with the work, I guess, you know, it's obviously very different than what I was doing in art school, which was definitely in the related media category. But it's the camera as a tool and the critical considerations that we all got to practice in class that I think ultimately end up informing the way you approach any situation. And again, it's that camera as a tool that helps me as a visual person assess whatever the situation is, whether it's this type of work or an interview with somebody or just walking down the street or whatever it is, to turn that into a narrative that I can absorb and wrap my hands around, wrap my head around, wrap my heart around, and hopefully help also tell the story that is critical to the work. So I went really quickly in the effort of time. If there's more to chat about, we can do it later when there's questions and whatnot. I hope nobody minds. And I hope that that helps paint a picture of my experience here, some of my photography, and a little bit of my maybe related, probably unrelated, or I don't know, related media work. Thank you.
I felt that was easier to go around that way.
That makes sense.
How's everybody doing, right? Excited about this. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay. So my name is Peter Schwartzbein. I was a graduate of the class of 2011. As Charles said, we were the founding class of the Scheinflug Society. I wanted to start off with this quote by Guillermo Gomez Pena that I think talks a lot about kind of my sort of relationship with art and with art making. And an artist imagines a better world and tries to render it in surprising ways. And this becomes a way for his or her audiences to experience the possibilities of freedom they can't find in reality. And I always like that quote. And I think about my own work. A lot of my work, I think, is kind of about understanding where I'm from and who I am. My father, when he talked about going to graduate school, he said that a master's degree in an education is like a passport. It doesn't necessarily take you anywhere, but it gives you the opportunity to travel. And I think that that's something that a lot of the work that we've all seen here that gives us the opportunity to go as far as we want. For me, I'm the son of immigrants, the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. My father's from Argentina originally. My mother was born in Toulouse, France. I probably could have been born anywhere, but I was born in El Paso, Texas, the capital of the border. Right there is a picture of Juarez, Mexico, and El Paso, Texas, which comprises the largest binational community in the world. Close to 3 million people share the same desert valley floor. This is a picture from the 1925 city plan of El Paso, the George Kessler plan. And you can see here in a section talking about economic influence that El Paso and Juarez are smack dab in the middle of the 2,000-mile long U.S.-Mexico border. And it's a border that for us has always been, we see it as an opportunity. And border crossing has always been something important. You can look 500 years ago to the Spanish colonial empire, and the Camino Real was the most important north-south trading route along the Spanish Empire. Went from Mexico City to Santa Fe. And the most important cross was El Paso del Norte, the Pass of the North. Those trading routes were founded by they were following a lot of indigenous trading routes as well. And we always had ways to cross. The first way that we crossed was Manny the Mule. She was a mule-drawn trolley that went between the two cities. In 1902, the trolley went from a mule-driven car to a all-electric car. And in 1950s, we received our PCC streetcars. These were Art Deco designed streetcars that were personally improved by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. And at the height of the line, there was over hundreds of trips a day between El Paso and Juarez, one of the only international streetcar lines. And this wasn't just an aesthetically pleasing way or a successful way of getting across, it was also an economic generator. For example, in the 1950s, the highest grossing JCPenney's in the United States was not found in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles. It was found in downtown El Paso. And it was because of Mexican nationals choosing to cross over the border every day to take their hard-earned dollars and pesos and hop on the streetcar and shop in El Paso. So one of the things that was fortunate as well was it was a city-owned streetcar line, and it ran until about 1974. And it was a victim of its own success in that when the streetcar closed down, it was closed down due to Mexican business interests who felt that it was too easy for folks to travel across the border. So you can see here, this is a picture I took during my thesis of one of the old streetcars there that was out dying in the desert. And you can see the two flags of our countries there. And in 1974, the streetcar closed down. And people still crossed, but it increasingly became more difficult. And in 9/11 was a really big difference for border crossing. That's where you used to have people who would drive over. It might take a half hour, 45 minutes. Suddenly it was taking 2 or 3 hours of crossing, and you still had people crossing. In the 5 ports of entry that are there within El Paso, we have 90,000 people crossing every single day, going back and forth between Mexico and the United States, between El Paso and Juarez. They're going there for school, they're going there for work, they're going there to visit family and for food. And things slowly started to deteriorate, and in 2009, the bottom hit with an explosion of violence due to a cartel fight for the trade route in there. And in 2010, when I started my thesis, there was more people killed in Juarez than there were killed in all of Afghanistan during that time, close to 3,300 people. And so being from El Paso, but living in New York, I had the opportunity to work at a couple different photo agencies and would work with photographers here who would oftentimes travel into El Paso and into Juarez, and they always wanted to know what was going on there. And they would ask me if I knew a fixer or what I should do. And I said, you should fly into El Paso, you should spend the night, call up my mother, she might give you a nice meal, and then you can cross over the border. And inevitably, what they would want was they would want to go into Juarez, find a fixer that would take them into the most violent part of Juarez so that they could get the shots that would fulfill what their photo editor would want them to see. And for me, growing up on the border, being a child of Frontera, I knew that the border was not about this place that divides, but it's a place that brings two people, that brings two countries together and really creates a third space. And to me, the streetcars are a really great symbol of that, right? The fact that border crossing defines us. And so for my thesis, I created the El Paso Transnational Trolley Project. It was an ad campaign for a fictional streetcar to run between the two countries once again in the not too distant future. Basically, the goals of the project are to try to imagine a better future between the two cities, because if you can't imagine a better future, you can't have one. And also to challenge representation of what it meant to be on the border. And with any good ad campaign, you need to have a mascot. And so Alex, the trolley conductor, was born. This is from our launch at Sunland Park Mall on Thanksgiving of 2010. You can see Alex over there. The original Alex, the trolley conductor, was played by Manuel Martagon, who is also a proud alumni from the class of 2011. I wish he was here, but he's awesome. And that is my brother over there, who played our one of the first spokespersons for the streetcar line. And he is going to have a baby in the next couple months, which my mother is very excited about. And so I just have a little video here to show you guys kind of Alex, the trolley conductor, in action, the border's newest hero. Let's see if this works.
Hello. What's your name? My name is Alex, the trolley conductor. And this is who you're playing today, Alec? Yes. Are you in a video game, Alec? I want to be in a video game. What was the inspiration for this character? The El Paso Transnational Trolley. Like some of your unions here today. Over there. Oh, they are? All right. Are you doing your family too? Yes. You know, most people want blood and guts and a sword. What made you pick this as a whole? I want to take people home safe on both sides of the border. Yeah! Right. All right, everyone do a skit for the judges. I think we have one more. Come on up. You're making me hungry. Come sit over.
So that was there, and these posters are going up probably during the height of the violence, when people really, aren't crossing over from the U.S. side, there's a tremendous amount of people that are coming up from Juarez and moving in El Paso. During this time in 2008 to 2010, for example, while the rest of the country was going through a recession, you could not find a vacancy of any apartments. You could not find a vacancy of any housing during that time. And I thought it was really important, again, to try to imagine something better. And I just wanted to take a little bit just to talk about my background before going into SVA. Was I worked as a photo editor. I worked at a camera store. I was represented by a photo agency, and I was in the Eddie Adams workshop as well, and photographed for a lot of different clients, mostly doing environmental and editorial portraiture. And so one of the things that attracted me to SVA was that with all the graduates that had come out of the program, there wasn't one specific style of an SVA grad. You had all different kinds of style, whether it was more photojournalism, more conceptual photography, and everything in between. And that really attracted me, because I wanted to go as big as I wanted to. That related media part of the photo, video, and related media, I think I took it to heart, and really think that that's a great strength of this program. So this is one of the poster designs, and we put these posters throughout El Paso and Juarez. So you can see this. We also put up some historic photos of the streetcars as well. This is actually one of the old streetcars there that was there in downtown. We put back up, probably a little bit larger than life. And so as the project wrapped up, or as I wrapped up with the SVA, with the thesis program in SVA, I felt like I wanted to go home. And I was invited to be part of a public art festival called Chalk the Block, which is actually happening next weekend, coming up, which is a really great public art festival. And they had a 60 by 8 by 60 foot chain link fence that they wanted me to cover. And they had a very small budget to do so, but it felt like it was a good opportunity to see where this project could go. And it felt like there was an energy and a momentum back home to sort of see how far this could take me. And so the night I landed, I started making portraits. Started making portraits at the El Paso Comic Convention, at different art openings downtown, in Juarez, in Las Cruces, New Mexico as well, at the Battle of the Claw, which is the oldest high school rivalry football game between El Paso High School and Austin High School. And if you ever know anything about Texas, it's that high school, Friday night high school football is king, even though I never went to a high school football game while I was in high school. And at the end of this, after about 2 months of photographing, I came up with this. This was a piece called Faces of the Frontera. It was a photo mosaic of a streetcar comprised of over 2,154 portraits from folks from Juarez, Mexico, El Paso, Texas, and Las Cruces. And it'd be hard pressed to find out who was on which side of what state and what country, and that was precisely the point. And so this is kind of one way that we had it displayed there as part of that Chocolate Block Festival. In the upper right corner, you'll see a piñata that we had of Alex, the trolley conductor. He had now entered into a whole new level. He was no longer human. He was a piñata. This was another commission that we had, putting it up through downtown. And, the streetcar was coming up there, really begging for people to believe in this better future, in this different kind of future that we could have between the two cities. And as I started coming home, I started becoming more civically engaged. I was invited to participate as part of a citizen review committee for our San Jacinto Plaza redesign. That's our downtown plaza. It's really beautiful now. And there was a host of recommendations from the citizen review committee, namely to keep the Luis Jimenez sculpture of the lagartos, of the alligators, in the center of our plaza. We used to have alligators in the middle of our plaza. It's one of these funny coincidences of history because alligators are not native to the Southwest U.S. desert. So, but we loved them and they were our own. We had ping pong tables, chess tables that were put in. And one idea was to have a streetcar cafe, kind of like a Shake Shack. You can actually see what ended up becoming a cafe. Well, when we showed these to city council, a lot of them were voted in except for the cafe idea with using one of the old streetcars. And in 2012, when they said this, they said, that's great, but those old streetcars that you photographed in the desert, whatever, they can't be used for a restaurant. They can never run again. And besides, we're trying to sell them to San Francisco. And I have no problems with San Francisco. I don't want anybody to think that I got a beef with San Francisco. However, these are our history, right? These streetcars used to travel 100 times a day. You can talk to anybody over the age of 50 in El Paso, certainly over the age of 60, and they remember riding them with their grandmothers, with their abuelos, with their moms and dads. So those streetcars have a very real value to people in terms of their memory and their identity. And so knowing that those streetcars were there and the city was trying to do it, and knowing that the city was looking into a quality of life bond initiative for 2012, we tried to hijack that bond initiative. And so we pitched a citizen-led, there's a section where citizens could write in what projects they wanted to see. And so Alex, the trolley conductor, who used to be there taking pictures and showing up at EPCON, was now asking people to sign a petition to support a vintage streetcar corridor to connect the university and downtown based upon a city-led plan that had been discussed in previous years. And we were at UTEP's campus. We were at the First Fridays, La Parada. A lot of the places that I went to collect portraits, I was now collecting petitions. And in a little under 2 months, we had collected more signatures than any other citizen-generated project, close to 2,000 signatures, more than a soccer stadium, an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And the city was able to use those signatures, not to put it onto the bond because they said a transit project couldn't be considered quality of life. And I think living in New York with the kind of public transportation you have here, you can make a very strong argument that transportation is inherently tied to quality of life, but I digress. However, they were able to use our signatures to lobby the Texas Department of Transportation for what eventually became a $97 million grant for a vintage streetcar corridor to connect university area with our downtown and our downtown bridges. So it seemed like it was all good, right? Except that we had a new mayor that came in and we waited. So in 2014, it was unclear whether or not the money would be accepted by the city of El Paso. And so rather than, and this is Alex, the trolley conductor, now sitting in one of the old streetcars, things have completely become unglued between reality and fiction and art and everything at this point. And so rather than waiting to see what happens, I decided to run. And so I decided to run for city council in December of 2014. I knocked on thousands of doors in the winter and spring of 2015. I waved at thousands of cars. You see how happy I am. And practiced for a lot of debates and forums as well. And just in the background here, just to give you a sense of kind of where we are in the world. So this right here is Mount Cristo Rey. There's about a 60-foot cross on top of it that was built by workers from an old smelter. And at that point is where New Mexico, Texas, and Mexico touch. It's an incredible hike. It's an incredible experience to be able to sort of see that. And after a long campaign with a runoff, we won. And this is my face. This is my face when I won. My first month, we had a bike share that was announced in City Hall, and so that's me riding on one of these bikes. This is at a Thanksgiving parade, shaking hands. And something else was happening outside of these events as well. The future was arriving on time on the border again. The money was accepted by the city. The streetcars, those PCC streetcars that FDR had approved so many years ago, were lifted up out of the desert, taken onto 18-wheelers to be taken to Brookville, Pennsylvania, which is the country's best streetcar remanufacturer. All of San Francisco's and Philadelphia and New Orleans streetcars are remanufactured there. You can see here, this is a picture of Carl Jackson, our streetcar manager, looking very happy. They were taken down to the shell. Tracks started coming back into town again. And for the first time in over 40 years, we had streetcar track back in El Paso streets. Those streetcars started to get fixed up, brought back to life. That sweet old 1506, she was the first one that came back. There's a very funny video of me online that you can see from the local ABC affiliate where I did like a live Facebook Live of them traveling out. It was about 15 degrees out. Entering into El Paso County. And then coming back home. There's 2 cars with that colorway. There's 2 with this as well. And then there's 2 more with a National City Lines motif where it's mustard yellow and then olive on the top. And so there's been a number of months of training right now with the streetcars. And actually today is the first day of pre-revenue service. So the streetcars today are actually running their route. This is one of the routes that they have right here. You can see here it's a 5.2 mile long line with 22 stops. Today was the first day of pre-revenue service, which means they'll be running their normal hours, which is 7 to 7, Monday through Thursday, 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. Friday and Saturday, 9 to 5 on Sundays with the $1.50 ride as well. So it's pretty exciting. We've kind of went full circle in that we just recently did a design workshop session with a public and mapping artist from Baltimore, Graham Coral Allen, where we actually had citizens ride the streetcar route, hop on and hop off in different neighborhoods, and talk about and discuss what they like with the neighborhoods that exist there and what they would like to see around the streetcar and what they would like to protect in a very bottom-up sort of planning session. And so it's just a very exciting time right now. Here's another picture. This is going to be one of the art cars is going to actually be hand painted as well. I think for me, what SVA had really done was really very much open up my mind and open up my idea kind of what art could be and how it could function in the world. And I think that probably what unites all of us sitting here is that, and which unite a lot of us as humans, is that we all have our different ways of leaving this world a better place. And there's numerous ways of doing that. Images can be one of them. Social work can be another, but I think we all have that responsibility. And I think I went a little bit over my time here, but I just have one last thing to show you, and that is what they look like running today.
No problem getting up, Stanton.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I want to start by thanking Charles and Liz for organizing this event. It's so exciting to be back. And I had a few memories today as I was walking past beautiful Gramercy Park, which used to be part of my walk. And one of them was when SBA brought Johann Diemenprez with his film Dial H for History. And it was while I was still a student, and it was sort of a watershed moment for me because I realized that the artist could be a historian, and that artists could weave together complex social issues and be a synthesizer in that way. And it changed the way I looked at art. I also remembered Charles telling us that we really needed to think about science. Art and science needed to get together. And at the time, I didn't really know what he was talking about, but it sunk in later. So I would thank him for that. And he also told me that I should spend more time looking out the window. So, which I also didn't get till later, but I thank you for that also. I personally like the term activist. This is something we were discussing before we came up, and I'm fond of it. We can talk about that more later. I wear kind of two hats. Well, I wear a lot of hats in life, but today I'm going to talk about my hat as an artist and as an art organizer. I'm a co-founder of the Canary Project, which I'll talk about today, and kind of the genesis of that project. I just want to point out the words. This is a graphic that we made 2 years ago for the 10th anniversary of the Canary Project, and the words around this graphic are borrowed from Marshall Gans, who is a senior professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And what he studies and has spent his life learning about and doing is organizing social movements. He worked for many years with United Farm Workers, with Cesar Chavez, and he also was the grassroots organizer for the Obama campaign in 2008. And these are the emotional cylinders that he feels are needed to make a successful social movement. And there are also emotions that I personally feel that art can activate. And no single artwork should be held responsible to activate all of these simultaneously. But I believe that they are things that as artists we can activate. So my work on these issues, on environmental issues, started when I read a series of articles in the New Yorker titled The Climate of Man, which became this book, Field Notes for a Catastrophe by Elizabeth Kolbert. And I remember very distinctly lazing about in Central Park, reading my New Yorker magazines, and my growing sense of alarm about this issue. I knew about climate change, but I hadn't ever quite, it hadn't hit me with such urgency before reading Kolbert's writing. She's now a friend, and I've worked with her on various issues. So along with my collaborator and husband, Ed Morris, we devised a project called A History of the Future, which is a photographic project looking at landscapes around the world impacted by climate change, which was a model that Elizabeth Kolbert followed in her book. So these are the locations that we photographed over several years. And the goal was to look at a variety of climate change impacts and to also look at those things happening in places where people live. We felt like there was a great deal of imagery coming from remote regions like the Arctic, and not enough from regions where densely populated regions. So I'll show just a few pictures. I'm really eager to get to conversation with these beautiful people here, so I'll try to move quickly. So this was actually the first location that I shot. It's a melting glacier in Austria. Initially, I piggybacked a lot of the work on commercial work because it took us, students, we can talk about this later, but it took us a while to get our funding together. So this was piggybacked on a commercial job. This is shot 3 months after the hurricane in Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina. And, it was interesting because I didn't come to this work with actually any background in photojournalism or environmental photography per se. So I brought sort of my own style to it, thinking that I would go and, come back with these pictures of, kind of real violence in the landscape. And in fact, what happened was often the opposite. I came back with these very kind of quiet images, which really made me start thinking about the nature of geologic time and how we as artists can represent that. This was a shot taken in Niger, which is in the Sahel region of Africa and has serious issues with drought. Surprisingly, this was taken during a period in the project where we felt that we needed images of hope. And I had read an article about tree replanting in this area and how it was changing microclimates quite successfully. And so all these indentations in the landscape are actually hand dug and designed to help the water sink into the landscape and collect kind of bits of seeds and other things as instead of getting blown across the landscape. This is a series of images that I took in Peru that traced the water from the glaciers in the Andes down to the desert coast. This is a melting glacier in the Cordillera Blanca. And I wanted to look at the ways that the disappearing glaciers would have direct impacts on the densest populations in Peru on the coast, which is where Lima is. So I really followed the water from the glaciers down to the coast. And this is a community on the edge of Lima that at the time did not have running water. That people here got their water delivered on trucks, which is quite common, but it also makes them very vulnerable to fluctuations in water price, which will be the result of water supplies diminishing. That is out of order. That is in the Cordillera Blanca. I didn't intend to go to Antarctica because for the reasons I stated before, but one of our advisors on the project had the opportunity to go. She was like a high-powered New York person who worked in a talent agency. She didn't have time to go to Antarctica, so she sent me instead. So this is the Russian base in Antarctica, and it was a really incredible experience. And very cold, yes, very cold. Incredibly beautiful and very cold. This is Coney Island after Hurricane Sandy. So after gathering this body of work, I realized that the work wasn't actually the images themselves, but the context in which they would be exhibited. We tried a lot of things to try to convey the meaning of this work, to try to convey the idea of geologic time and like the urgency of what's going on. And in this particular exhibition, we paired the images with objects from various collections at Indiana University and had virtually no text in the gallery, although some was available at the entrance to the gallery. We've also exhibited the work in science museums where it's like there's words all over the place and people children touch the images, and it's, you know, a very different kind of vernacular for it. This is somewhere in between. This is at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Sides of buses with the language of advertising, you know, like you have to be able to sort of get it as the bus goes by. So, you know, very bold language. And it was really, you know, these kinds of experiments that made me realize I wanted to kind of expand what I was doing and work with other artists in different types of media. And part of that came out of an acknowledgement that my photographs are kind of quiet. They're not like loud activist type images. This is a billboard in Columbus, Georgia. And this is after the climate talks in Copenhagen failed, and I was very depressed, so we just hung dark cloth over the photographs. So that was really when the Canary Project was born, was out of this interest of kind of expanding our work to be able to collaborate with, we were already collaborating with other types of artists in the project, like the Billboard Project, but to expand that. And we can talk about this more when we all get together on the panel. But we devised, one of the first things we did was to do a poster project, which was inspired by World War II posters. And which we noticed, like a lot of World War II posters were about things that environmentalists care about, like plant a garden and carpool and all these things, and for the sake of being patriotic. And it was interesting to think about the environmental movement as possibly being patriotic. And so our like liberal advisors were like, no, you can't have the word patriot in the title of your project because, you know, that is a word that, you know, like that's a bad word, and you can't have a gun, but we did it anyway, and and my mom was very worried about it. But and so this is a project where we solicited posters from. There was a brief, like, you know, to make a poster that would encourage people to embrace sustainability, you know, kind of individual action in a collective framework. And we got posters from well-known designers like Shepard Fairey. This was designed by Michael Beirut, who's the head of Pentagram here in New York. This is a bus campaign in Cleveland, which is where he's from. And we did workshops with kids where they would learn about issues and then kind of how to express themselves through making posters. This is the book. That's the cover by Shepard Fairey. So that's a book that we put out in 2008. And of course, these posters were used also in the context of protest. These are some other projects that we did. This was at Socrates Sculpture Park. We had a group of albedo pilgrims. They wore white and they'd go to art openings and other events and talk to people about climate change. Albedo is a scientific phenomena where white surfaces like ice and snow reflect heat back into the atmosphere, whereas dark ones like open water that we will get more of actually make the earth hotter. So it's this like complicated, difficult, like scientific term. And these were the pilgrims who would go and explain it to people at art events. This is Eve Mosher's project, The High Water Line, where she drew a chalk line around 70 miles of New York and Brooklyn coastline, showing the new flood line mark for, well, combined storm surge and vulnerability to flooding. And in this project, it's really Eve's project, and we worked as producers. We helped her with research and doing a documentary. We stored her chalk for her in our studio. So in this case, we were, acting more as producers of the project. And this was the research that she based her project on, something that, most of us would not read, but it did, turn into a New York Times article, something that people could understand, so through the lens of an artist's piece, you could understand this sort of complex scientific material. And finally, a couple more recent projects. This was another piece that was inspired by Elizabeth Colbert, the New Yorker writer, this time on her work on a species extinction. So this was a piece to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the extinction of the passenger pigeon in 2014. This was at Mass MoCA, and it was a video installation along with a sound piece. And in this version, if it's going to play, maybe it's not going to play. It was on a series of monitors. So the birds, we worked with an animator, and the bird's shape was actually designed to resemble the body of a passenger pigeon. They, in reading many accounts of them, they apparently loved to flock together densely. The piece is called Eclipse because James Audubon likened a crossing of the passenger pigeons to a noonday eclipse. Apparently, when they migrated, they were just in bodies of millions of them migrating. And they went extinct very quickly because of hunting and other damage to their habitats. And it was a watershed moment because people in 1914 didn't really understand yet that we could make a species go extinct. I'm gonna zoom forward here. So eventually the birds would fill up this entire space. And it's on a 7-minute loop. Finally, this is current work on water in California. We're looking at water and relating it to other forms of extraction. So this follows a body of water from the Sierra Nevada to end use in Big Ag. This is an exhibition of the work, but we're also coming out with a book in 2019 of this work. And this is my office at Syracuse University, so where I teach art and ecology type courses on things like art and ecology, food, and shelter, animals. This was one that dealt with with trying to deal with ideas around the Holocaust. This was last weekend. Seitu Jones came, and we were partnering with Brady Farm in Syracuse. It was a great event. So thank you so much.
We had talked about among ourselves having a conversation about activism and art, and that seems perhaps to be a wasted opportunity with everybody out there. So if y'all have questions for us, either as a collective questions about art practice or specific questions, have at it. We have a microphone here, right? Microphone there. So please, any questions for anybody about anything? Otherwise, I'm going to freestyle up. No. Seriously, about anything, about specific things, about this notion that some of us have kind of wrestled with this idea of what does it mean to be an activist and almost shunned it, and other folks who have actually embraced it. What do you think? Any of you out there? Don't make me call on you. Oh yeah, please take that time to absorb what you saw. Yes, absorb. Okay. Anybody now, please. Hello. Questions, comments, concerns. Like, you know how those people who will say, this isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. You can do that now.
Well, if anybody was concerned about how to contribute for my campaign for re-election, I'll pass these out right now.
I want to know, so is being a politician part of your art practice? Like, would that be a viable mode for MFAs? Like, I'm just thinking this is the next wave.
Well, I mean, so, well, obviously, I think on one hand, that cross between art and public policy, and I don't like the term politician as much as public servant, because in the actual practice of being an elected official, it's more public service. It's a lot. I mean, a lot of what you're doing on the very local level is helping people and trying to connect them to what is a very large bureaucracy in terms of the institution. Campaigns are a little bit different in that there is a fundraising aspect, there is a narrative building aspect. I think when you're talking about creating a project for your work, or others as well, like that's part of it, is how do you go and synthesize what it is that you're trying to do? How do you go and fundraise or write that grant to make sure that you're able to do it, or to look with other ones as well, so that whatever you're doing it, even in the case of the Transnational Trolley Project, we had started a Kickstarter here when I was to pay for Manuel to come down to El Paso for our campaign kickoff and to play for the We Pace posters and such. I think that being an artist, again, we look at things from different perspectives. I think when it comes towards public policy, being able to create and present things in novel ways, I think.
I just thinking about public servants and politicians. We're momentarily in a bubble here. It's a lovely bubble. But we're in a political environment where many of our so-called public servants are not serving us. They're actually doing violence to our democracy by destroying the notion that that discourse should be evidence-based. And I feel like the themes here, investigation and really embracing and engaging with the empirical, run counter to what's happening, at least in many of the back rooms where I live, and possibly in Washington, D.C. as well. So, I mean, that's another reason why I wanted to engage you folks out there. What are y'all doing? What are you thinking about? In this particular political environment, when evidence-based work, whether it's art, whether it's writing, it seems to me to be under threat. And it's lovely to talk about it here, but do you contend with this? Everybody up here obviously does, but I'm really trying to throw it back to you, because you have this opportunity to address some folks who are on the front lines now. And I'm sure you, in your own ways, are on your own front lines as well. So I'm being serious now and not being funny.
Well, what do you think was the biggest hurdle to get these projects going besides something like finances? Like almost something like psychologically, like how do you start something and put yourself out there in that way?
Well, I can go first and be very quick. Our project involves, as I said, trying to reclaim historic African-American cemeteries. When we met with some success, the projects were in a way co-opted So our public service servants, air quotes, came in and found a way to essentially co-opt the narrative and to co-opt the funding. So we are left with trying to continue to do our work and I have to act as a journalist in this case in order to make public certain documents that have been kept private and to continue to build a community around the process of historic reclamation. Again, physical reclamation and the historic and narrative reclamation. You can't just clean up a place and then think everything is going to be wonderful because these places have been disinvested of their value. And it can be a Black cemetery or it can be a Black community, but this idea that Black things have less value than white things, history has acted on these places in a particular way to devalue them. So we need to do work, narrative work, and I know people have talked about narratives here, to reinvest them with that value. And part of that work is fighting to get our political power back, is fighting to say, we are entitled to this money as the grassroots.
I think the work. All right. I think something. What I'm about to suggest, I think, also intersects with a question that I wanted to pose to the panelists as well as the audience, which is, how do you find hope in times like this? And so maybe I'll return to that question in a second after I say what I think.
It's very related.
Which is, as you see what is going on around you in your house, city, state, country, or world, and you ask yourself whether or not you are comfortable with that which you see, or that statistic that you read, or the sea level rising that you're aware of, or your own hometown concerns, you have to ask whether or not you're comfortable with that. And if you're not comfortable with it, then you have to ask what it is that you can do about that, whether it is big or small, a tiny step or an action or a hand extended to somebody or a private foundation started or whatever that is. You have to be able to say, this is what I can do. And so if I say I can take a picture and it'll be decent and it'll help me show an effective way of reaching men and leveling a ratio of stigma and sexism and access to healthcare, cool, I can take that picture, or be on a board, or speak at an event, or whatever that is that you can do and are impassioned to do in the work of the panelists here that has been so inspiring for me to see. So maybe that helps find a little bit of hope. I have other thoughts about hope that sometimes are great and sometimes depressing, but that's a question that I wanted to pose without any other questions on the table.
That's a great question.
Anybody in the audience?
Yay.
Brian, I have a question for you. Not only do I think I remember watching you on CNN, like in 2002, 2001. What was the first year of this program like? What was the highs? What were the lows?
Wow.
You said you made some, some suggestions.
Well, so, I mean, 1988 feels to me almost like this time, right? I mean, we had the AIDS crisis. We had a couple of years later, tremendous unrest and tension, racial tension in Crown Heights between Afro-Caribbean folks and Hasidic Jews. We had a lot going on. And I see this wonderful facility here, but I also remember what it was. And what it was is it was us, it was you. There was a tremendous amount of concern and there was some hope. We were buzzing with activity. There were people who were taking naked pictures, and there were people who were doing street photography, and there were people who were doing conceptual things as well. And we were engaging with each other. We understood that we were the program, and we were engaged in the world outside. I think it was us. It was that energy. It was a wonderful time. It was a formative time. ACT UP was doing its thing right down the street, right over here, right over there. You couldn't ignore it. You had to, if not be a part of it, then make a decision to turn it off. And I don't think too many people made that decision. It was amazing. It was an amazing time to be at SVA. It was an amazing time to be in New York. It was a privilege. Thank you.
It's overwhelming. I think that's how we probably all feel. With all of your presentations and activism, and although I don't like that word, you're doing something for the community and in a very local way in this case, and I think that the car also is community. I mean, it's not only the fact that you have put together a project is looking at the future, people are gonna relate to each other, neighborhoods are gonna start to. So I think America has that. It's one of the issues. The communities are so expanded that you just get on the car and then you speak with the neighbor. You have that sense that maybe you have in come from Europe and you do. But I don't have the answer. You're saying what to do, right? But I mean, maybe you have to look what happened that we have reached this point. I think there are values in this society that need to be start changing. Competitiveness, the values also of silly things, but high school, you're talking about football, that male representation with the cheerleaders, it's kind of like, what's going on now? It's for me, it's so, it's carrying so many values that have, in a way, taken you where we are at the moment, that maybe it's a whole process. Time, but I think it's hard to reinvent America right now because to accept that there's not such a dream, such a myth. I think that is what is it's hard to take because it's a beautiful dream, but you have to go down on the ground and
yeah. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily about reinventing America. I mean, to your question, you asked what makes you kind of go after it. It's, I mean, the work pushes you, right? At an eventual point, I think all of us said, we're just going to let the work take us wherever it goes. And we're just going to sort of jump with both feet first and not really knowing where we land. In the case of me, it was going back to El Paso, which after high school, I probably said I never was going to come home again. Never was going to come home again. And going and pursuing a project, pursuing an idea, reclaiming something there. Eventually, all of us here and all the students here, you're making a body of work or something. And I'm not going to say it's a spiritual thing, but it's something where logic would say, I'm graduating with an MFA from SVA. I should probably stay in New York and do something photo related. That's what logic says, but my heart said, let's go back home, right? You were dealt with something similar with CNN. Y'all are dealing with something similar as well. One book totally changed where you were going, how you thought. And you have to let that voice come out. But in regards towards high school football and that sort of thing, I think what's what is missing more than anything else is folks not listening to each other in this country. And it's a very fortunate position to be in New York City, where people's ideas are in some ways very open towards a lot of ideas, but the same way folks have a similar thing there too. With that high school football team and the cheerleaders, there's also the high school band guys and the band women. And they're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, playing their bassoons, playing their tubas, learning music, which is a creative pursuit. There's other groups as well. And I don't think it's about reinventing America as much as America letting itself listen to each other and breathe. And that's a harder and longer conversation there, because it's not about that cemetery being put higher than the other cemetery, but it's understanding that those two cemeteries have always existed there and deserve the same amount of respect. And those stories that are there from those cemeteries are both American stories through and through. And how do you go and let those stories accept each other and not try to put a plus or a minus down and just say, this is, these cemeteries came up in different ways, but we're going to maintain them. We're going to maintain them at the same level now. Every single one of these stories, whatever part of the cemetery you're on, is just as valid and just as powerful and just as important.
On the question of hope, I think this is really connected to what you're saying, Peter, is that, for me, I think the way that I don't really hope is that I don't work alone. I don't think these are times to be alone with your anxiety about what's going on. It's find people to work with and because I can't really just give up, because I've worked with a bunch of people, and I would not just be letting myself down now. It's also, a team. And I also think that if you're an artist, it can be really hard to work on political issues alone. It's you feel really exposed and you feel like you're going to be open to a lot of criticism. And I think it's feels like there's danger there. And so, collectivize, collaborate. I think that's a really helpful way to kind of keep moving.
So maybe I have a question. So especially, some of you are working collaboratively with other people, but for artists and for many of us, I think we are recognizing that we are living in times nowadays, especially recently, that are most difficult, and all the issues that are coming up are equally important. And how, maybe that's a question or maybe an observation, how do you as artists or as individual artists discern and separate what you should work on? Because it feels as if though every issue, and for us as visual people who create visual commentaries, everything seems to be equally important. And it's not like we have one, we may all have one topic that we would like to work on, but right now it just seems that everything lends itself and has an urgency. So how do you separate that? Do you ever, do you have a problem of how do you decide which way to go and what to work on?
I'm not sure whether it was Susanna or Quinn who said the very profound thing. You have to ask if you're comfortable with this. It was you, Quinn. So for me, I worked on a number of issues, war and so on and so forth, and those were meaningful to me. But when I was confronted with something that I thought was deeply unfair, but also something that I thought had the potential to be truly transformative, this restoration of a historical narrative that could give new meaning to people's lives. So for me, for example, to understand what it means fundamentally to be an American, to have an entirely new chapter of American history open for me as a 50-something-year-old African-American man, to know that my ancestors liberated themselves before anybody liberated them. They fought for their own freedom. What would that mean to a 12-year-old boy or girl in Gilpin Court, Creighton Court, in these so-called public housing projects in Richmond, Virginia, or here? I was not comfortable with the glorification of the shit that we see on Monument Avenue. These things that were, these monuments that are ideological weapons. And that may seem like a small thing when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about war and brutality and things like that. But to me, this was fundamental. I was not comfortable with the existence of that narrative, and that narrative being supported, that false narrative being supported, that Black things don't matter, and that these exalted Confederate things matter tremendously. That, to me, I think, does violence to people's psyches, and I understood at my advanced age that it did violence to my psyche. And when I learned that there was other information out there, that was liberating, that was transformative, and that hit me personally. I was not comfortable knowing that I could do something in this city to begin to change the way people think, first about history and then about themselves. And that's where the hope came in as well. We just have to work together. We just have to allow ourselves to feel that discomfort, certainly. But you also can't wait for someone to say, hey, you know, this is something you should do. I think when you feel it, you will know, when you see it. I was hung up on, well, this is such a small story. It's a small little story in Virginia. This is not Afghanistan. This is not China. This is not. I was not comfortable with being told that I was less of an American by sons of Confederate veterans, and having people tell me that, well, slavery had some good points to it, civilizing and Christianizing influence. I was not comfortable with that because I knew in my bones, and I knew from books too, that that wasn't true. And if they're selling that to kids, white or Black, that's a crime. I wasn't comfortable with that. So thank you for that lens to look at it. Look at this issue. What are you not comfortable with? And what can you change? Maybe not alone, but maybe with some other people.
Can I make this the mic on?
Not really.
How's it on?
You actually turn it on.
I'm getting paranoid about this mic thing. All of the younger people here who are currently students, and even some of us older artists, photographers, creative people, we always look at somebody who's behind that dais. You know, these are the authorities. These are successful people. They're here. They must be perfect. You know, these people aren't perfect. I've known these people. And they're still struggling with trying to find their identity as a creative person all the time. And what are you not comfortable with? What book moved you on? You know, going home, going back to an inspiration of your grandmother. They're all artists. They all maintain other creative ventures. They all integrate those ventures into their discovery of what moves them. And one of the reasons that many of you are in this room is you're experimenting to find that. And you've come to this with the aspiration to be, for lack of a better word, professional creative artists and communicators, lens arts, screen arts people. And, you know, you got to kind of touch that thing that moves you. You got to say, what is it really? You can't make it because you saw it in somebody's gallery or you saw it in the newspaper back. Or, you know, that must be the thing that will make it. It doesn't work that way. Yeah, but you're always, they were overwhelmed, you know.
Yeah.
Believe me, they were overwhelmed. And look at the experimentation they all did. And they're still doing it, you know. They're still evolving it. And there's no question that working in communities really helps. And we are a community here. New York is a big place. There are a lot of choices. There's no question to your answer that these choices are daunting, you know, and there's so many ways to work. But essentially, you got to say, well, who am I and who might I want to become as a decent human, creative contributor to a society which I can't make perfect, but I can make a change, a little change.
I have another question. We started to talk about the bubble. I think, here we are in an art school. There's a lot of us who are liberal. We're in New York City. How do you approach somebody with completely different point of views from you? And and give us advice?
So, where are those cards right now? Everybody who has them, can pass them out. So, I'm glad. If you haven't got one, make sure you get one. And you can contribute at peterfordistrict1.com. So,
by the way, all of these projects need support.
Yes.
One way or another.
So
that might not just be monetary.
if you're interested in running for office, find out who shows up and votes, because we have a very low voting percentage in most parts of this country.
Yes.
And knock on their door and meet them and listen to them. If not, you can drop off one of these. And what I've been doing for the last 3 months is I'm about 2 weeks away from early voting. November 6th is the election. There's going to be a really large turnout in Texas, mostly because of the U.S. Senate campaign between Beto O'Rourke, who is a congressman from El Paso, former city councilman from El Paso. Woohoo! Yeah. And Ted Cruz. Yeah. And so one of the things that I've been doing for the last 3 months outside of fundraising has been a lot of boots on the ground, knocking on doors. And my district is relatively diverse in terms of its politics, in terms of its socioeconomic status. It probably has one of the highest percentage of college graduates. It has the area right by the university and the area by the country club as well, or one of them. And so in dealing with that, you deal with a lot of different opinions. Some of the folks who are Trump supporters, who are a different mindset than probably a lot of the folks in New York. And you try to listen. And it's a little bit different than wanting to engage. I think one of the things that we see is a polarization of media, where people on Facebook, on social media, have the same websites or the same places that reinforce their perspective, and rarely do they sort of come across each other. And so it's easy to yell at somebody on a Facebook wall. It's another thing to sit in front of them at their door and listen to their concerns and try to explain yours. But I think it takes a little bit of, when you want to go out and say you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you listen to them and say, I understand what you're saying, but did you ever think about this? Or did you ever think about this perspective? And that is a harder thing to learn when we increasingly live in this world where we're more comfortable yelling at each other as opposed to listening.
I would suggest seeking diverse audiences for your artwork. One of the beauties of art is that we don't have to yell at each other when we share an experience of an artwork. We can have our sort of understandings of it and reactions to it. But if that works better if we want to get the work outside of our bubble. So that's sort of been part of the mission of the Community Project, is looking for ways to move the work, outside of the white cube, and I think allowing the art to do what it does, which is open conversations, question things, and allow people to, feel and think.
Just picking up on the theme of, and you're all touching on it, the necessity of having conversation. Versus, in a way, it also requires objectivity and openness on any side. It seems like you had a debate internally amongst yourselves about whether you're an activist or active. And it's just interesting in the context of these themes, what informs your view on whether you can, it's not merely semantics, I'm assuming. There's something in this environment that's driving you to say you're an activist or not. So maybe expanding on that would be interesting.
Well, for me, it may be semantics actually, but it also may be a bit of history. So I think someone mentioned, I think Mom, in our earlier discussion, how activist in a certain generation, certain time was used as a pejorative. It was the person holding up the sign, waving, screw you, dump this, whatever. And I understand that that's not what it means. I understand that to be a genuine activist is to be active. So the word isn't really, it just has that association for me. I prefer to consider myself a citizen, and whether I'm a photographer, whether I'm an image maker, videographer, writer, whatever, I am a citizen. I'm an active citizen, and that to me is the most important thing. My current boss at VCU talks a lot about communicating across difference. And we talk about intersectionality and we have all these wonderful words now for talking to people who may not agree with you or talking to people from different backgrounds. And I think that's essential. I also, however, think that it's essential to understand when and with whom you can have conversations, because I find that I'm often, not often, but sometimes speaking to people who are hiding behind their privilege. Whether it's whiteness, whether it's maleness, whether it's wealth, and they're adopting poses, they're adopting politics. And it's very difficult to communicate to someone who understands that he or she can hide behind those things in the age of Trump. Maybe if you're private, maybe if you're at a dinner table or conversation, you can have a discussion across difference in which you can both grow and change. But I have to pick my fights. I have a lot of conversations in public spaces where people see me and assume that I have particular politics because of my race. I can't have conversations in that moment that will be profitable if people are making assumptions about me. So I have to go elsewhere. And I also can't have profitable conversations in particular moments when I've determined that someone is hiding behind their privilege, meaning that great example, speaking to a young white male professor before the election, talking to me about how he was going to vote for Donald Trump because he was going to blow everything up. What does that mean exactly? What does that mean, blow everything up, as if this were a science experiment? These are people's lives. So maybe if we'd been able to hang out and have a conversation, so on and so forth, great. But in that moment, I did not want to, I wanted to do no harm. So I didn't get into a fight. But I also had to reach out. I also had to connect to people with whom I could have a conversation and with whom I could generate hope. So I am not kumbaya in that respect, but I do feel that you can have profitable conversations with people across those differences, but they have to be able to see you for who you are. If you're queer, Latino, Black, male, female, whatever, they have to be able to see you, and they have to be able to have a conversation with you as if you are a human. And if they can't do that, I'm not going to spend my time trying to win them over in that moment. What I'm going to try and do is to create the circumstances in society to allow them to grow and change and to run them the fuck over if I have to. And I hate to talk like that, but sometimes we have to do that. If you are proposing policies and spouting ideology that hurts me or that has a potential to injure me, not figuratively, but literally, I'm not about having a conversation in that moment. And again, I want to talk about hope. I want to talk about faith. I want to talk about collaboration and community. And I'm working on that with my people and with people speaking across difference. But if people come at you with a knife, you got to jujitsu the knife out of their hands, or you got to do something else. That was a little bit of a freestyle. I apologize.
I think something that occurred to me while hearing this and thinking about, in the back room, I said I don't consider myself an activist, but it occurred to me that we all have the capacity to engage in activism or to be activists. So maybe it's just semantics, or maybe you think about your internal clock of your life and say, well, less than 50% of my time is spent engaged with activism, so I'm clearly not an activist. But which I think is frankly probably part of why I said that, because it's not the majority of my time. But like ETAF has funded advocacy events that connect advocates with their representatives in DC. When he was a senator, I met with Jeff Sessions and asked him to support a comprehensive sex ed bill, that after which he reminisced about the good old days, but said he wouldn't block it. So does that mean that in that hour meeting, you have the opportunity to engage in activism, and it doesn't have to be your entire life, or it is your entire life, and that's great. Either end is great, which goes back, I guess, to just what can you do, whether it's a phone call or talking to somebody at the other end of a doorway that you've never knocked on before, or jujitsuing.
Like the jujitsu.
No, it's really awesome. It took me time to absorb to all do, but I think that each one of you carry different ways of dealing with your art. You're no longer in your solo studio to yourself intimate. You really carry your art, each one of you in your own field out. So I don't think you have any choice, to be honest. And I think your artists are innocent outside our, people look at, oh, you're an artist, so they let you work. But there will be a time where an artist makes a point where you're going to meet people who are composing. And I'm sure you did. And I'm sure you will. There will be people coming into your graveyard and maybe will oppose what you do, but you're going to keep on doing it. And that's the steps that I saw in each one of you. You're going to be able to help and carry the torch, for your family and the company that you're representing. And he takes it through politics, but it's art that really derives in each one of you, whether it's weather, climate, everybody knows climate is changing. Everybody knows it. Everybody's talking about it. There will be people who oppose you law by law, but you are carrying something with you to the world, and you're not going to stop. So this body of work is influential. That's all I'm taking out of it. It's really nice. It's great. And it's part of your activism. What do you call it, activism or not? I don't know.
Whatever. Yeah.
Do you carry yourself as an activist, and that's why? No, something carried you through and probably changed your path through your art. You're gonna.
Yeah.
That
I mean, I think
bus
there's-
is going to go be something else.
Streetcar. Not a bus. It's not a bus. I think it's interesting because you have this like sort of this tension between the artist and the activist. And undergraduate, I was an English major. There was a great essay at Langston Hughes talks about this sort of tension and this role of community and the artists and the racial mountain, and what is the role and responsibility and that tension there. Artist just wants to be able to make whatever their heart desires. An activist has a role, responsibility of their community, or to speak out to their. And I don't necessarily think that, I don't necessarily agree with that dichotomy in a certain sense. Well, I think the thing about activism versus artists is that what I've seen with a lot of the work here is that it has all of those. It has a creativity and an open-endedness, but at the same time, it's dealing with issues that affect the real world, right? Issues of identity. I mean, that's constantly back and forth. I'm sure that there are students here that are dealing with that where they want to go with their work and where they don't. I think for, I speak for myself here. One of the things that I saw sometimes with the program was that there was other students that seemed to be making work that was geared towards the art market, and I never could do that with my work. I wanted work that could engage in the real world, that could be beautiful, that first of all be visually and conceptually engaging. You should be able to see it on a wall and then want to understand what it's about without having to have a 3-page essay about theory to let you into the work. But that was me. And so I think for my work, you have to have that aesthetic approach. I mean, your work is very beautiful, lyrical, and sublime, while also exposing really harsh realities about our world now. But I think without that aesthetic approach, you wouldn't necessarily open as much to that message. And even with Brian's work, I mean, this is the first I saw of the work with cemeteries, but it's a very simple isn't the right word, but it's just the approach towards it is very simple but profound. And it all comes down to the concept, right? It all comes down to what is it that you're trying to say work. And I think for a lot of us, that's not necessarily rooted in, again, you said not an activist place, but an active place of wanting to engage in the world as opposed to turn our backs.
I just briefly wanted to go back to Barbara's question about what topic, what issue do you pick? And I think I was trying to pick issues when I was in graduate school. I wanted to do the most important issue. And I don't think that's a great approach. I think, as Peter was saying, you can go home, you can be in the world, you can figure out what you're not comfortable with, and it can be apparently a small thing. But you do have to get on the subway. You have to go uptown, downtown, crosstown. You do have to leave your comfort zone. I'm not going to call this a bubble because there's a lot of wonderful ideas happening in here. But you have to be among people. And they can be people who you do not know, who you may disagree with or you may not. But I think the small can be wonderful. But you only discover those small things or those potentially interesting and moving things by being among people who might not be like you. And I think that is what an artist can be doing at this point in time. Yeah.
Yes, addressing, I know you were asking about the ideas that keep re-emerging. Personally, I feel less seeing hope, where is the hope? Rather, I need to channel my anger. And how do I do that? And for me, I have learned so much more about politics, about law, about, here we are in the United States of America. This is still a democratic society. And everyone, voting November 6th, who have you spoken to? Who are you blaming in your neighborhood?
Right.
What are the issues? We are all activists, and I can't not do something, whether I'm an artist or whether I'm a senior citizen, or, we all have that ability. So being informed, number one, and we have that access, just get away from a lot of the networks. Judy Woodruff is our piece every night, watching PBS, going to New York Public Library, listening to lectures. We're so fortunate to be in the city and have access. And we have to get out of our bubbles because there are plenty of people in the city that do not think like us.
Correct.
And it's the least likely of people. So having a civil conversation, because anger is just fueling everything that's happening around us. And we're all angry, but if we can't listen to our neighbors, then we're part of the problem.
Earlier in our discussion, the word investigative,
Mhm.
which I think is what all of us are also. Maybe instead of, we need to investigate what's out there, and that's listening is part of that, looking, getting out of the public. I guess I would only conclude that statement by saying, I wish those who oppose this were equally investigators.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't, I think you can be angry and I think you can be hopeful, because I am, as you probably guessed, very angry, but I'm not enraged. And I think I raised my father, the example of my father before, because I think he was so enraged that he could not have those conversations with people. My anger can drive me out into the world, and it can allow me to do the type of investigation and research that you're talking about, but it's not going to go away. But there's also this hopefulness and I think this courage. I mean, I am angry at injustice, but I'm hopeful that I'm going to find the next person who wants to fight that injustice or at least talk about it with me. That's just who I am. So when I'm not angry, I don't know, I'm not sure I'm going to get stuff done, but I am now hopeful because I have faith. I actually have faith in what I'm doing, and I have faith that other people are energized and passionate about these same things. Sorry for the...
Let's do one more area of question. One more question.
Actually, two more actually. So I got two questions, but they are not my question. They're from another student, also from this program, Jonathan, who unfortunately got flu and is watching the live stream in home. But yeah, you can say hi to him actually. So like his first question is like, how did you all utilize the resources of SVA in the years after graduation for all these projects you mentioned? And
heavily.
And the second one is actually, I see it also as an extension of the former question we touched. Was there ever a time when aesthetics had to yield to the overall mission of the work? So those are the two questions.
Yesterday. So yeah, I mean, we can be brief. So I used the resources of the human resources. Charlie graciously allowed me to print, to work, to screen video, to do so much here. Without this site, I would not have been able to do so much of what I've been able to do when I lived in New York, and even when I moved to Richmond and I come back to New York. And in terms of this, maybe someone else can tackle the aesthetic question.
Just in terms of SVA, I mean, I think I also continued to make my work here for quite some time, but I also had my network. You know, I had my cohort that I studied with. I mean, the late nights, the critiques, and we all helped each other a lot when we got out of school, in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
So important. I think in the years after. Anyone?
Yeah, I think being able to stop in is always nice and see it there. I think one thing that I think is obviously the cohort, your band of brothers and sisters that you go to war with here at SVA, but also the professors as well. Most of the faculty here are working artists as well, and they're a tremendous asset, right? To create friendship with, to create coffee and conversation with, to ask some advice, to ask their guidance or their feedback on your work moving forwards. And so, keeping your network of your friends here from the program, but also reaching out to your professors is also really good too. And in terms of that, I don't know if it's a work-life balance or you're talking about aesthetics and projects. It was a conversation I had with Charlie and Professor Leslie maybe 6 months ago when I came down for Passover. here back in April, and I was, just talking and thinking about the future. And there's times where your work is not going to look the same as the work you were making 5 years ago, right? Your studio time might not be the studio time you had before. Your production might not be the same. Where I'm at right now, I'm not shooting at the same level that I was before. But I'm okay with it because I'm working within the medium of policy as opposed to lens-based art principally. And as we all know, you need to have your camera with you if you're going to get a photograph, unless you don't use cameras and you use scanners or something else. Point being is that I think you also have to be flexible towards how you express yourself and what you're comfortable with, and understanding that is not a constant, but it's a ebb and a flow based upon with what you're making and where you are in your life.
I think we better have some wine and cheese. One more? Go ahead.
No, it's no problem. I was just gonna say I agree.
I'll
leave it at that.
I just got these late this afternoon. These are from the exhibition in the SBA Alley. A wonderful show, and these are free. So there's some in the back, some here, and some up there. I urge you to take one. They're really remarkable use of lithography. And I'm very important people who are doing the important thing visually. Beautifully designed.
Thank you all for coming. It was a pleasure.
He's trying more questions.